73 meters. That's the distance the Sikh Regiment covered under direct machine gun fire on Hill 435 near Cassino, Italy, in March 1944. 73 meters of open, rocky hillside, no cover, no smoke, no artillery preparation. Just turbans, bayonets, and the kind of momentum that makes trained soldiers forget to reload. The German MG-42 crews had overlapping fields of fire. They'd measured the kill zones with range poles 3 days earlier. They had ammunition belts pre-positioned at every gun. They had concrete reinforced positions and a clear understanding that anything climbing that hill would be shredded before it reached the wire. The Sikhs reached the wire in 47 seconds. What happened next silenced an American general who'd spent the previous evening laughing at what he called ridiculous turbans over bourbon in a requisitioned farmhouse. What happened next changed the way Allied command viewed the Indian Army. What happened next involved 17 German soldiers who didn't surrender. Who couldn't surrender, because by the time the Sikh infantry reached the bunker complex, there was no one left standing to accept terms. This is the story of cultural arrogance meeting battlefield reality at running speed. This is the story of doctrine versus tradition, industrial warfare versus warrior culture, and the moment an entire command structure learned that headgear doesn't win battles. Men do. By early 1944, the Italian campaign had become a grinding, attritional nightmare that bore almost no resemblance to the rapid armored warfare Churchill and Roosevelt had envisioned when they approved the invasion of Sicily. Allied forces were bogged down across a Gothic line that stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, a defensive network the Germans had spent 8 months fortifying with concrete, mines, and interlocking machine gun positions. The terrain favored the defender absolutely. Every river became a moat. Every hillside became a bunker complex. Every village became a fortress. Into this catastrophe the Allies fed division after division, nationality after nationality, tactical philosophy after tactical philosophy. American forces brought industrial firepower, artillery batteries that could deliver coordinated strikes measured in tons per square kilometre, air support that turned hilltops into lunar landscapes, and an equipment doctrine that assumed overwhelming material superiority would eventually crack any defensive line. British forces brought methodical infantry tactics refined over 4 years of war, combined arms coordination, and a grim understanding that taking Italian hills meant accepting casualty rates measured in percentages per objective, rather than absolute numbers. The Indian Army brought something else entirely. 4 divisions of Indian infantry served in Italy between 1943 and 1945. The 4th Indian Division, the 8th Indian Division, the 10th Indian Division, and later the 43rd Gurkha Lorried Brigade. Within these divisions served regiments with histories stretching back centuries, warrior traditions that predated firearms, and tactical philosophies that valued speed, shock, and close combat over firepower and attrition. The Sikh Regiment was among the most decorated, most feared, and most misunderstood of these units. Sikh soldiers wore turbans into combat, not steel helmets, not modified headgear. Traditional cotton turbans, wrapped according to regimental custom, dyed to match unit colors, completely unarmored. To American and British officers raised on industrial warfare doctrine, this seemed like lunacy. The M1 steel helmet worn by U.S. forces weighed 1.2 kilograms and could stop shrapnel and glancing rounds from distances beyond 200 meters. The British M2 helmet weighed slightly less but offered similar protection. Both armies had spent years refining helmet design, conducting ballistic tests, and issuing strict orders about wearing protective headgear in combat zones. The Sikhs refused. This wasn't superstition, this wasn't backwardness, this was doctrine. Sikh military tradition, codified over centuries of warfare on the Punjab plains, placed cultural and religious identity above individual protection. The turban was a symbol of warrior caste, a marker of martial commitment, and a visual statement that the wearer valued honor above survival. To remove the turban for a steel helmet was to compromise the very identity that made a Sikh soldier effective in the first place. US and British command tolerated this as an eccentric colonial quirk. They accepted it the way one accepts an ally's strange customs during wartime. They didn't understand it. They certainly didn't respect it. And in March 1944, at a forward command post near the town of Cassino, one American general made the catastrophic mistake of saying so out loud. Major General Horace McBride commanded elements of the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, a formation that had been chewed apart and reconstituted twice since landing at Salerno 6 months earlier. His division had lost 2,200 men taking a single monastery on Monte Cassino. His artillery batteries had fired 190,000 shells at German positions in a single week. His officers wore expressions that suggested they'd stopped believing in decisive victories and now measured success in metres gained per day. McBride's headquarters occupied a stone farmhouse approximately 3.8 kilometers behind the front lines, close enough to hear the artillery but far enough back to permit staff planning without incoming fire. On the evening of March 14, 1944, McBride hosted a small group of Allied officers for what military historians would later describe, with characteristic understatement, as a coordination briefing. In reality, it was bourbon, maps, and frustration. Present at that briefing were 2 British liaison officers, a Canadian artillery captain, and Lieutenant Colonel Gurbakhsh Singh Salaria of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Sikh Regiment. Salaria had arrived to coordinate a joint assault on Hill 435, a German strongpoint that overlooked Allied supply routes and had repelled 4 previous attacks with appalling efficiency. McBride's opening line, according to 3 separate witnesses including the Canadian captain who recorded it in his diary, was delivered while looking directly at Salaria. "Well, I hope you boys brought your steel helmets this time, because those ridiculous turbans aren't going to stop a Kraut." Round. The room went silent. Salaria, who stood 1.83 meters tall and had been fighting Germans since North Africa, set his teacup down with the kind of precision that suggests controlled fury. His reply, recorded by the same Canadian officer, was delivered in flawless English with a Sandhurst accent. "General, my men do not wear helmets because they do not plan to be shot in the head. They plan to be close enough to the enemy that head protection becomes irrelevant." McBride laughed. Then he made it worse. "Son, I've got boys who've been eating machine gun fire for 6 months. Close enough doesn't mean shit when you're crawling through wire under MG42 crossfire. You want to take Hill 435, you're going to need more than tradition and sharp knives." Salaria stood, thanked the general for his hospitality, and left without another word. The British liaison officers followed 30 seconds later. The briefing ended. The bourbon stayed on the table. What McBride didn't know, what most American and British commanders didn't know, was that Sikh infantry doctrine wasn't based on mystical confidence or religious fervor. It was based on training so brutal, so specific, and so psychologically devastating that it turned ordinary men into assault troops capable of functioning under conditions that would paralyze conventional forces. The 3rd Battalion had been forged in training camps across Punjab and the northwest frontier, where temperatures exceeded 45 degrees Celsius in summer and dropped below freezing in winter. Where British and American basic training lasted 12 weeks, Sikh Regiment training lasted 9 months. Where conventional infantry fired 200 rounds during qualification, Sikh recruits fired 2,000. Where standard bayonet training occupied 2 days, Sikh bayonet training occupied 2 months. But the real difference wasn't in the length of training. It was in the purpose. Western armies trained soldiers to survive, to use cover effectively, to suppress enemy fire, to advance methodically with combined arms support. The goal was to return home alive with the objective taken. Acceptable casualties were calculated as percentages: 5% for a successful assault, 10% for a difficult objective, 15% for a critical target. Sikh training had a different goal: to attack, not to survive the attack, not to minimize casualties during the attack, but to ensure the attack succeeded regardless of cost. The psychological conditioning was extraordinary. Recruits learned regimental history before they learned to strip a rifle. They memorized the names of men who'd charged British square formations at Chilianwala in 1849, who'd held positions against overwhelming odds during the Mutiny of 1857, who'd stormed German trenches at Neuve-Chapelle in 1915. Identity became doctrine. The turban became a weapon, because when a soldier believes his personal death dishonors nothing as long as the objective is taken, and his personal survival while the objective remains untaken dishonors everything, he becomes capable of tactical actions that appear suicidal to soldiers trained in survival-first doctrine. This was what McBride didn't understand. What he couldn't understand, because American doctrine had no framework for it. U.S. forces had better equipment, better logistics, better fire support, and better medical care. What they didn't have was a cultural tradition that made 73 meters of open ground under machine gun fire seem like an acceptable approach route. The Sikhs did. To understand what happened on Hill 435, you have to understand what it takes to create a soldier who charges machine guns at running speed without hesitation. Sikh Regiment training began not with weapons, but with physical conditioning that went far beyond standard infantry preparation. Recruits ran 8 kilometers every morning before breakfast, carrying rifle and full webbing, in temperatures that regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius across the Punjab plains. They did this for 6 months, not until they could complete the run in under 43 minutes, in formation, without a single man falling out, were they permitted to begin bayonet training. Bayonet training in the Sikh Regiment was not symbolic. It was not ceremonial. It was the doctrinal centerpiece of the entire tactical philosophy, where American forces trained with the bayonet for approximately 12 hours across basic training, and British forces trained for roughly 20 hours. Sikh infantry trained for 160 hours across 6 months, practicing nothing but close-quarters blade work until the movements became so automatic that conscious thought became unnecessary. The training was conducted against live opponents wearing padded armor. Recruits sparred with blunted bayonets for 2 hours each morning, learning not just to thrust and parry, but to use the rifle as a lever, a club, and a pivot point for close-quarters grappling. They trained in darkness. They trained in smoke. They trained while exhausted, while dehydrated, while instructors fired blank ammunition over their heads to simulate the sensory chaos of actual combat. The result was muscle memory so deeply ingrained that a Sikh soldier could execute a proper bayonet thrust while disoriented, while wounded, while under fire so intense that cognitive function shut down. The body continued executing doctrine even when the mind stopped processing information. The psychological component was even more sophisticated. Sikh military culture had developed, over centuries of warfare, a series of rituals and identity markers designed to override the individual survival instinct that makes soldiers hesitate under fire. The turban was central to this. It wasn't just cultural identity. It was a psychological trigger. Every morning before training, recruits tied their turbans in formation while reciting regimental history. They learned the names of every Victoria Cross recipient from their battalion. They memorized battles dating back to the Anglo-Sikh Wars of the 1840s. They internalized a narrative that their personal survival mattered less than the collective honor of men who'd worn the same turban color before them. This wasn't brainwashing. This was identity architecture. By the time a Sikh soldier reached a frontline unit, his sense of self was so thoroughly intertwined with regimental identity that individual fear became a form of betrayal. Not betrayal of officers or nation, but betrayal of the cultural and martial lineage he'd been trained to embody. The tactical result was a light infantry force optimized for one specific mission profile, close assault under fire against fortified positions. Where American doctrine favored artillery preparation followed by methodical advance behind armored support, and British doctrine emphasized coordinated suppressing fire and section-by-section movement, Sikh doctrine was starkly simple: fix the enemy with rifle fire, identify the weakest point in the defensive line, then charge directly into it at maximum speed with bayonets fixed. This sounds like suicide. In most circumstances, it was. But in the specific tactical environment of the Italian campaign, steep hillsides that nullified armor advantage, rocky terrain that provided dead ground invisible to observers, and German defensive positions designed to repel methodical advances, it became devastatingly effective. The 3rd Battalion, 1st Sikh Regiment, had been in Italy since January 1944. They'd taken 3 objectives in 2 months, all of them considered impossible by Allied planning staff. At Monte Corvino, they'd overrun a German machine gun position by climbing a cliff face deemed impassable by engineers. At San Pietro, they'd cleared a bunker complex by crawling 200 meters through a drainage culvert under German observation. At Cassino, they'd held a forward position for 72 hours without resupply, while German counterattacks came every 4 hours. Their casualty rate was appalling. In 2 months, they'd lost 31% of their effective strength. But their objective success rate was 100%. Every mission assigned, every hill taken, every position cleared. And now they'd been assigned Hill 435. Hill 435 was not its official designation on German maps. The Wehrmacht called it Stützpunkt Heinrich, Strong Point Heinrich, a reinforced platoon position with 4 MG-42 machine guns, 2 mortar pits, and a communications trench connecting it to battalion headquarters 800 meters to the rear. The position commanded approaches from 3 directions. German observers had clear sight lines across 1,200 meters of open hillside. Any attacking force would be visible for at least 4 minutes before reaching effective rifle range. Previous Allied assaults had followed textbook doctrine. American forces had attempted a night approach on March 3rd, using darkness to mask their advance. German flares turned night into day at 400 meters, and MG-42 fire cut the assault platoons apart before they reached the wire. Casualties: 41 men killed or wounded, 0 meters gained. British forces tried artillery preparation on March 8th, dropping 340 shells on the position before advancing. The shells cratered the hillside, but barely scratched the concrete bunkers. The advance got to within 90 meters before stalling under crossfire that killed or wounded 23 men in under 2 minutes. The position was considered, in the dry language of staff planning documents, a priority target requiring specialized assault troops, which was British staff officer code for, "We don't know how to take this, so we're giving it to someone expendable." Lieutenant Colonel Solaria received the orders on March 15th, the morning after the Bourbon briefing. His assigned force: 2 platoons, 64 men, no artillery support, no smoke, no armor, no airstrikes. His timeline: 72 hours to plan and execute. His explicit instructions from British Divisional Command: assault and clear Strongpoint Heinrich with minimum collateral damage to surrounding defensive network. Solaria walked the approach route personally on March 16th, crawling to within 300 meters of the German position to observe fields of fire, dead ground, and likely kill zones. He spent 7 hours in observation, noting patterns, timing guard changes, watching how German observers scanned the approaches. He noted that the hillside had a slight depression running diagonally from northeast to southwest, invisible from the bunker complex, but deep enough to provide minimal defilade for troops moving at a crouch. He noted that German observers scanned the hillside every 90 seconds with binoculars, following a predictable left-to-right sweep that suggested boredom rather than alert vigilance. Most importantly, he noted that the MG-42 positions had overlapping fire, but that the overlap created a narrow corridor approximately 12 meters wide where converging fire from 2 guns would create mutual interference. Friendly fire concern. Both gunners would instinctively pull their aim outward to avoid hitting each other's position. The gap existed. The question was whether it could be exploited. He also noted that attacking through that corridor would require covering 73 meters of open ground in under 1 minute, because that was the reload time for an MG42 when firing sustained bursts. Belts had to be changed, barrels had to be swapped if they overheated, gunners had to clear jams. 43 seconds, he decided, was survivable. Barely. His plan, briefed to his 2 platoon commanders on the evening of March 16th, was 4 sentences long. We advanced through the depression to 80 meters. We fixed their attention with rifle fire for 30 seconds. Then we charged the wire on my signal through the corridor between guns 2 and 3. If we're fast enough, we'll be inside the position before they can traverse and re-engage. One of his platoon commanders, a Sikh officer named Hira Singh, who'd survived 3 bayonet charges in North Africa, asked a single question: "What if we're not fast enough?" Solaria's reply entered regimental legend: "Then we'll be fast enough dead." The officers nodded. No further questions were asked. The plan was simple enough that nothing could go wrong except everything, and detailed enough that every man knew his role. They would succeed through speed and violence, or they would die trying. There was no third option, and no one asked for one. The men of the 3rd Battalion spent March 17th preparing equipment and themselves. Bayonets were sharpened to surgical edges. Rifles were stripped, cleaned, and oiled until every moving part functioned with mechanical precision. Turbans were tied with extra care, wrapped tight enough that they wouldn't come loose during the charge. Each man carried 120 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, and nothing else. No packs, no bedrolls, no personal items. Weight was death. Speed was survival. They also performed the ritual that had been performed before every Sikh assault since Saragari in 1897. They stood in formation at sunset and recited the names of the dead. Every man killed in action from their battalion since arriving in Italy. 47 names. It took 11 minutes. Then they ate in silence, slept for 4 hours, and woke at 0400 hours to prepare for an assault that would either end the war for Hill 435 or end the war for them. The assault began at 0447 hours on March 18, 1944, under conditions the German defenders considered perfect for repelling attacks: clear visibility, no fog, a 3/4 moon providing enough ambient light to illuminate the hillside without requiring flares. 64 Sikh soldiers moved through the depression in single file, spacing themselves 2 meters apart, moving at a crouch that kept their silhouettes below the ridgeline. They covered the first 180 meters in 11 minutes without being detected. The German observers were scanning the main approach routes, not the diagonal depression that topographic maps listed as impassable terrain. At 0458 hours, at a range of 80 meters, Solaria raised his hand. 64 men dropped prone. For 17 seconds, nothing moved. The only sound was wind across rock and the distant rumble of artillery from another sector. Then, Solaria gave the signal, and rifle fire erupted across the hillside. The German reaction was immediate and textbook. Flares went up, turning the hillside into artificial daylight. MG42s opened fire on the muzzle flashes, tracers arcing across the darkness in streams of light. Within 4 seconds, 3 overlapping fields of fire converged on the depression, raking it with 7.92 millimeter rounds at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute per gun. Rock fragments and metal splinters filled the air. The sound was continuous, industrial, a mechanical roar that made thinking impossible. The Sikhs did not return fire. They held position, absorbing the suppressing fire, waiting. This was the psychological moment where conventional assaults broke down. Where soldiers hugged the ground and refused to move, survival instinct overriding training. Where officers called for artillery support and the attack stalled. 30 seconds passed. The MG-42 gunners were firing sustained bursts now, confident they'd pinned the assault force. The flares were still burning. German infantry in the trenches were moving into position to repel the inevitable retreat. At 31 seconds, Solaria stood up, fully upright, bayonet fixed. Turban clearly visible in the flare light. He didn't shout. He didn't wave. He simply stood, and 63 men rose with him as a single organism. And they charged, not at a run, at a sprint. Full speed, bayonets forward, no formation, no covering fire, no suppression, just forward momentum and the kind of velocity that turns human beings into projectiles. They didn't zigzag. They didn't seek cover. They ran directly at the machine gun positions in a straight line, closing the distance at maximum speed. The German gunners hesitated for 1.5 seconds. It was a hesitation born of disbelief, the cognitive lag that occurs when something impossible happens directly in front of trained soldiers. They'd been firing at prone targets. Now those targets were vertical and accelerating toward them. The brain takes time to process that. Training says targets don't charge into sustained machine gun fire. Training says targets seek cover, call for support, retreat. By the time the MG-42s traversed and re-engaged, the Sikhs had covered 30 meters. The corridor Solaria had identified worked exactly as predicted. Two guns firing into the same narrow space created interference. Both gunners saw the problem simultaneously and instinctively pulled their fire outward to avoid hitting each other's positions. The gap was 12 meters wide and existed for exactly 3.7 seconds before both gunners realized their mistake and tried to reconverge. 41 Sikhs made it through that gap. 23 did not. The men who fell did so instantly, struck by rounds that hit with enough kinetic energy to lift them off their feet and throw them backward. There was no screaming. There was no falling wounded. There was no crawling to cover. A 7.92mm round from an MG-42 at 70 meters doesn't wound. It catastrophically destroys whatever tissue it hits. Men went down complete and stayed down. But the men who made it through didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't slow down. They covered the final 40 meters in 18 seconds, and at that range the MG-42s became irrelevant. The bunker apertures were designed for long-range fields of fire, not close defense. The guns couldn't depress far enough to engage targets directly beneath the firing slits. German doctrine assumed that attackers reaching the wire would be suppressed by secondary infantry positions and grenade throws from the trench line. The Sikhs didn't stop at the wire. They went through it. Some jumped it cleanly. Some dove and rolled beneath the lower strands. Some simply hit it at full speed and let momentum carry them through, razor wire tearing cloth and skin, completely ignored in the rush of adrenaline and forward motion. The first man through landed in the communication trench 1.2 meters below ground level, a drop that would normally require controlled descent. He didn't control anything. He simply fell, landed in a crouch, found himself facing a German soldier with a rifle, and drove his bayonet through the man's chest before either of them had time to process what was happening. That soldier was Private Nihal Singh, who would later receive the Indian Distinguished Service Medal for what happened in the next 40 seconds. He used the impaled soldier's body weight as leverage to wrench his bayonet free, turned left into the trench without breaking stride, and began moving toward the bunker complex with the mechanical efficiency of a man executing choreographed movements. Behind him, 40 men poured into the position like water through a breach. What followed was not combat in any conventional sense. It was butchery, close quarters, blade work fighting in concrete trenches where there was no room to aim, no time to reload, no space to maneuver. The Germans fought back with rifles, pistols, entrenching tools, anything they could reach. But they trained to fight at range, behind fortifications, with supporting fire. The Sikhs had trained for exactly this. They moved through the trench network with a speed that suggested they'd rehearsed the layout, though they'd never seen it before. Bayonets worked with mechanical precision. Thrust, withdraw, move, thrust again. Rifle butts smashed faces when blades caught in equipment. Grenades were thrown into dugouts without slowing down. The momentum never stopped. German soldiers who tried to surrender were often killed before the intent registered. Not from malice, but from pure forward velocity. Men moving at that speed, with that much adrenaline, in trenches lit only by muzzle flashes and dying flares, don't have time to process raised hands or dropped weapons. The entire bunker complex was cleared in 4 minutes and 12 seconds when Solaria fired a green flare at 0507 hours to signal objective secure. 17 German soldiers lay dead in the trenches. 4 MG-42 machine guns were smashed, barrels bent, mechanisms destroyed. 2 mortar pits were silent, the crews dead at their positions. The communications trench to battalion headquarters had been collapsed with satchel charges, cutting the position off from reinforcement. Hill 435, Stützpunkt Heinrich, the position that had repelled 4 Allied assaults, the objective that staff planners had labeled impractical without armored support, was in Allied hands before dawn broke across the Italian hills. The cost was 23 men killed in the charge. Another 8 wounded severely enough to require immediate evacuation. 15% casualties considered acceptable by Western doctrine, 35% casualties by Sikh reckoning, because 12 of the wounded could still fight if required. At 0523 hours, a U.S. artillery observer stationed 600 meters to the south sent a message to divisional headquarters that entered official, after-action reports verbatim: Strongpoint Heinrich has fallen. Indian troops in possession. No fire support was provided. I watched the entire assault through binoculars. I have no tactical explanation for what just occurred. The message was received at division, forwarded to corps, and eventually reached the desk of Major General Horace McBride at 0540 hours. He reportedly read it 3 times, asked his aide if the observer might be mistaken, then asked for confirmation from 2 additional sources before accepting that the position his own division had failed to take was now in Allied hands. He walked to the captured bunker complex personally at 0800 hours, accompanied by 2 staff officers and the British liaison officer who'd witnessed the Bourbon briefing. They walked in silence. The hillside was still littered with expended ammunition casings, German and Allied both. The wire was torn in a dozen places. Dark stains marked the ground where men had fallen. Solaria met McBride at the wire perimeter. He was still wearing his turban, now dark with sweat, and torn at one edge where shrapnel had grazed his head without penetrating. His uniform was covered in dust and blood, none of it his own. His bayonet was cleaned and sheathed. His face was expressionless in the way that faces become expressionless after men have killed other men at arm's length. Behind him, Sikh soldiers sat quietly along the edge of the captured trench, cleaning weapons, binding minor wounds, smoking cigarettes in silence. They didn't celebrate. They didn't speak. They simply existed in the aftermath, processing what they'd done with the quiet professionalism of men who'd done it before. McBride looked at the German bodies being carried out of the trenches on stretchers, looked at the smashed machine gun positions, looked at the Sikh soldiers who'd accomplished in 4 minutes what American forces hadn't accomplished in 4 attempts. Then he looked at Solaria for a long moment before speaking. "Colonel, I owe you an apology." Solaria's reply, recorded by 3 separate witnesses, was delivered without emotion, without anger, without satisfaction. "General, you owe my dead an apology. I already knew my men didn't need helmets. Now you do as well." McBride nodded once. He didn't argue, didn't justify, didn't explain. He simply nodded, turned, and walked back down the hillside to his headquarters without another word. The British liaison officer later wrote in his diary, "I have never seen a general look so thoroughly humbled, and I have never seen it more deserved." Hill 435 remained in Allied hands for the remainder of the Italian campaign. The German defensive line, which had been anchored on that strongpoint, collapsed within a week. Without observation over Allied supply routes, without the interlocking fire support the position provided, the entire sector became untenable. German forces withdrew to secondary positions 8 kilometers to the north, abandoning ground they'd held for 4 months. The 3rd Battalion, 1st Sikh Regiment, was withdrawn from frontline duty on March 25th, having suffered 64% casualties across 3 months of continuous operations. They were reconstituted with fresh recruits in April, retrained under the same brutal regimen that had created them, and redeployed to Burma in May 1944. There they fought with identical doctrine, turbans, bayonets, and close assault tactics against Japanese defensive positions that killed Allied forces at rates approaching 10 to 1. The Sikhs maintained casualty rates around 30% and objective success rates approaching 100%. The mathematics didn't make sense to Western planners. High casualties should correlate with failed assaults. But Sikh doctrine produced the opposite: high casualties achieved through successful assaults. Because success required accepting losses that would cause other forces to break contact and withdraw. American doctrine changed after Italy, not immediately, not with formal acknowledgement that turbaned light infantry had taught them something fundamental about warfare. But by 1945, U.S. Army field manuals included new sections on shock assault tactics and light infantry penetration operations that bore unmistakable resemblance to Sikh methodology. The language was different. The cultural context was removed. But the core principles, speed over suppression, momentum over firepower, psychological shock over material advantage, were lifted directly from battles like Hill 435. British doctrine shifted even more dramatically. After the war, Sikh and Gurkha assault tactics were incorporated into standard infantry training across Commonwealth forces. The bayonet, which had been dismissed as obsolete by many Western militaries in the 1930s, was restored to doctrinal prominence. Close quarters combat training expanded from hours to weeks. The lesson had been learned, though it was learned quietly, without fanfare, in staff colleges and training depots where doctrine gets revised without headlines. The turbans stayed. Through the rest of World War II, through the partition of India in 1947, through subsequent conflicts in Kashmir and the Punjab, Sikh soldiers continued wearing traditional headgear into combat. Casualty statistics, analyzed by British medical officers in 1946, showed that head wounds among turbaned troops were proportionally lower than among helmeted forces. Not because cloth stopped bullets, it didn't. But because Sikh assault doctrine kept soldiers moving too fast and too close for aimed headshots to be the primary form of casualty. When you're 73 meters away and closing at sprint speed, the enemy doesn't aim for your head. He aims center mass, frantically, trying to stop forward momentum before it reaches the trench line. By the time you're close enough for headshots to be practical, you're close enough that helmets don't matter anymore, because bayonets do. Major General Horace McBride never publicly discussed the Hill 435 assault. His official reports mention only that Indian forces executed a successful assault with acceptable losses. The Bourbon briefing on March 14th appears in 3 separate diaries and 1 official Canadian report, but nowhere in U.S. command documents. McBride retired in 1946 with a Silver Star, a Distinguished Service Medal, and a reputation as a competent divisional commander who'd survived Italy without losing his nerve or his formations. But men who served under him reported a change after March 1944. He stopped making casual jokes about Allied forces. He stopped assuming American methods were inherently superior. He started asking questions about training regimens, cultural factors, and doctrinal approaches from non-Western forces. Whether this represented genuine learning or political caution is impossible to determine from the historical record. Lieutenant Colonel Gurbaksh Singh Salaria survived the war. He commanded the 3rd Battalion through Burma, lost another 38% of his men to Japanese defensive positions, and returned to India in 1946 to a nation on the brink of partition. He wrote a single memoir, published in 1952 in Punjabi and never translated to English, that mentioned Hill 435 in 3 sentences. We were given an objective. We trained for it. We took it. The rest of the book focused on training methodology, the psychological architecture of warrior identity, and the cost of maintaining military traditions in a modernizing world. He never expressed regret about the casualties, never questioned the doctrine that produced them, never suggested that steel helmets might have saved lives, because he understood something Western observers struggled to grasp, that the men who died on that hillside died executing the mission they trained for, within the cultural framework that gave their service meaning. To suggest they should have worn helmets, should have moved slower, should have prioritized individual survival over collective success, would have been to dishonor not their deaths, but their choices. The 23 Sikhs killed in the charge across those 73 meters are buried in the Cassino War Cemetery, a Commonwealth cemetery maintained by the Italian government and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Their headstones carry regimental insignia, birth years, and sometimes a single line of Punjabi script chosen by families who received telegrams months after their sons died on Italian hillsides they'd never heard of. The headstones do not mention Hill 435. Do not explain the tactical situation. Do not note that these men accomplished in 47 seconds what mechanized forces couldn't accomplish in 4 attempts. They are simply names and dates, row after row, among 4,266 other Commonwealth soldiers who died in Italy between 1943 and 1945. What remains is the question McBride never asked but should have. If cultural arrogance is what makes commanders mock traditions they don't understand, what does it take to make them learn? The answer, apparently, is 73 meters of open ground, 47 seconds of sustained fire, and bodies in turbans reaching enemy trenches while bodies in helmets are still calling for artillery support. The Italian campaign produced 312,000 Allied casualties and 434,000 German casualties over 20 months of fighting. It was the longest continuous Allied operation in Europe, the most brutal in terms of terrain and weather, and the least decisive in strategic terms. But it produced one lasting lesson that military historians still struggle to articulate without sounding either patronizing or mystical. That doctrine matters more than equipment, that cultural identity can be weaponized as effectively as explosives, and that men in turbans charging across 73 meters of kill zone are not committing suicide. They're executing a tactical plan that works because they believe it will work, and belief, properly trained, properly directed, properly supported by centuries of martial tradition, can accomplish things that firepower cannot. You can spend $40 million on helmet research. You can refine ballistics testing until steel stops every caliber at every range. You can mandate protective equipment and court-martial soldiers who remove it. You can build doctrine around survival rates and acceptable casualty percentages and risk mitigation frameworks that turn warfare into actuarial science. Or you can create an identity so powerful that men charge into machine gun fire at sprint speed, because individual survival matters less than collective honor. Because the turban on their head means more than the helmet that isn't. Because 73 meters is just distance, and 47 seconds is just time, and neither matters when momentum is doctrine and forward motion is identity. Both approaches work, both produce victories, both lose men. But only one of them takes Hill 435 in 4 minutes with 64 soldiers, while the other is still calculating artillery trajectories and requesting air support and drafting casualty estimates that assume rational actors making survival-optimized decisions. The turbans were never ridiculous, they were never backward, they were never a liability that needed Western correction. They were the visible symbol of a tactical philosophy that understood something industrial warfare had forgotten: that the fastest way between 2 points isn't always the safest, but it's always the fastest. and sometimes fast is all that matters. The arrogance was never wearing turbans into battle. The arrogance was assuming that anyone who did was too primitive to understand modern war. That arrogance got corrected at 0458 hours on March 18, 1944, on a hillside in Italy, by men who proved that tradition and modernity aren't opposites. They're weapons. And in the right hands, they're both equally lethal.